Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our May 2026 tour, Mary Queen of Scots, From Crown to Captivity, is now open for bookings. This incredible week-long experience takes in many of the most iconic historical sites associated with Mary in her native Scotland, featuring Stirling Castle, Edinburgh Castle, the Palace of Holyrood House, and many more. Featuring Dr. Anna Turnham as our historian in residence, and featuring talks from noted historians, including Dr. Linda Porter, this tour will also feature some fun, thoroughly Scottish experiences, including a very nice whisky tasting evening. To discover more on this and secure your place on this or any of our other live tours, or to sign up to latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. Coins are a physical, tangible link to the past. History in metal that we can carry in our own hands. Coinage is central to the history of Great Britain, made more fascinating still because of our long and rich monarchical history. In today's episode, the 100th episode, I'm thrilled to Gregory Edmund from Spink Auctioneers. An expert in coinage, Gregory joins me to discuss something known collectively as the Carrington collection, a remarkable 130-piece collection of coins starting way back with King Henry III in the 13th century through the Hundred Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, and ending with Queen Elizabeth I herself. Stay tuned to find out how gold coinage made its way into England, why a coin ostensibly made for Richard III bears the markings of the nephew that he usurped, and how Henry VIII's infamous Rolodex of wives complicated matters when it came to Henrician money. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 100, the Carrington Collection, a history of royal coins, with Gregory Edmund. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Gregory Edmund. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on, Adam.
You're very welcome. This is episode 100 as well, so it's quite a special one.
Okay. I've brought up the century. Very good.
Yeah.
Not bringing in cricket analogies, but there we go.
Yeah, and it's also a slightly different episode because, and don't take this the wrong way, you're not a historian. You work for Spink and Sons, a very established, very noteworthy auctioneer. And we're here to talk about the Carrington collection, which is a fascinating collection of 130 coins from English history. Before we get into that, though, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay. So firstly, can you introduce Spink and Sons to me and your role within?
Of course, Adam. I think when we think of auction houses, we have this very conceived notion that it's going to be, specialists towards the end of their professional lives, having learned for 30, 40, 50 years wisdom that can't possibly be shared with anyone else. And I suppose that's sort of the impression you get when you think of Spink, which as of 2026 will be celebrating its 360th year of business. So it's one of the world's oldest continuously operating auction houses, alongside the names of Sotheby's and Christie's. It has that sort of renown within the world of numismatics, the study and passionate collection of coins. But it has also branched out in its over 3 centuries of history to sell fantastic works of art, silverware, watches, maps, stamps, banknotes, military medals, and so only a couple of weeks ago, we sold the 89th Victoria Cross that we've handled in the last 50 years. So when there are only 1,350 odd Victoria Crosses in the world, if we've handled 90 of them, we clearly have some reputation and some renown in that particular field as well.
Yeah.
So Spink sort of is more than just a company; it's an institution at this point. And certainly there'll be people that are familiar with the brand name because they'll have had dad's collection, mum's collection, great aunts, great nephews, grandfathers that will have come across Spink.
Amazing. And what do you do within Spink?
So I joined Spink in September of 2016, so I'm just coming up to 9 years now. And I started as a junior specialist within the coin department. My background interest, certainly since sort of teenagehood, was in numismatics, in coins, because I found that they're a wonderful window into history. And to have that tactile, tangible nature, which you potentially don't necessarily get unless you're an archaeologist trawling in the ground, or possibly if you go around some of the great old English country houses and you sort of feel the history around you, you don't really get that resonance unless you physically hold coins. And I think that captured my imagination very early. Yeah. And so from that, I went through secondary school on to university to do numismatics as one of my modules when I did ancient history at Warwick. And then in September 2016, I joined Spink straight after a short stint as a scholarship at the British Museum. And since then, I've worked my way up into a position of not just being a senior specialist within the coin department, but now heading the coin department. And so I now have a team of half a dozen very, very talented individuals from all walks of life. And what potentially surprises people about the makeup of Spink, as I mentioned before, is it is no longer people towards the retirement end of their professional career. You have a lot of under 30s, very passionate university graduates who come in and they cover all sectors of the departments we operate in. And my team comes from English literature backgrounds, art history backgrounds, medieval history, Byzantine history. And so in terms of the actual people and the passions behind the organisation where I work in, and obviously the team I now head up, is very, very diverse in its interests. And so I'm very fortunate that obviously I have this burning passion for coins, but I'm surrounded by people that sort of keep me tethered and keep me grounded and keep me realistic about how you can actually interact with that and how you can sell those things to people.
It's so true what you say about coins as well, because they are, unless you're deeply inappropriate, you're not going to go and like run your hand down a painting in the National Portrait Gallery or anything. But with coins, you have that ability to literally get them in your hand. I mean, I was introduced to you very kindly by Dr. Peter Stoffel. I met him at the start of the year at the Catherine of Aragon Festival. And whilst we were talking, he pulled out these Queen Mary I coins that he allowed me to handle. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, it's literally a piece of history in the palm of your hand, which I thought was just there's just something, they're very tangible links to the past, aren't they?
It's probably one of the burning questions of our time is how do we identify ourselves? What do we associate with, whether it's with a community, whether it's individually, whether it's with a nation? I mean, the discussion of nation statehood is such a powerful topic at the moment, whether in Europe, in America, or the Far East. And coins have that tangible nature, which is, yes, they're connections to our past, but they also tell us who we identify with. And obviously in Britain, we're so blessed by having this continuous stream of royalty, which gives us this founding rod by which everything sort of sparks out from. And so when we hold a Tudor coin, you are holding something that is part of your national identity, but is also something that is fundamentally a propaganda message. And, I've had many discussions with Dr. Stoffel about what is it from an academic perspective that he feels when he holds them, and what is it a collector appreciates. And there is a surprising difference between someone that's studied the texts, has understood the person, and can look at the object as an object, and those that collect the objects purely in that context of them being a coin. And that's what's perhaps surprising and perhaps frustrating as an auctioneer, because I try to bring in the historical narrative that your listeners will absolutely engage with, and whether they have a passing interest in Tudor history or whether they are mad passionate and they want to visit all the country houses, they want to, study every text, they want to know the next thing about Anne Boleyn or whoever it may be. I want to be able to connect those people with the people that potentially have the financial means to own these things, and then potentially champion tomorrow's private museum or public display of these things. Because the other surprising feature about a lot of coin collectors is they do want to display them. They do want to celebrate and share that history when they can. Some are very private and they don't want to, but I've been to plenty of exhibitions which have some wonderful collections privately built up of these things. And it gives me a great joy to be able to put the coin in its context, but also have someone who has the means to own it and then share it, because that's a wonderful, altruistic feat that I think should be championed ultimately, and then should be the responsibility of an auctioneer to try and get that there, because we shouldn't be hiding history away. We should be celebrating it and exploring it as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just curious, what is the most unusual item that has come up for auction under your watch?
I suppose for me, I still pinch myself when I remember the story of the Henry III gold penny. Now, the Carrington collection actually has one of these, but there's a separate one that was found by a metal detectorist back in 2021. And bless him, Michael Lee Mallory was his name, metal detectorist that hadn't been out for 10 years, had been basically pushed out by his long-suffering wife, I'm sure he'll admit to, with his children to do something on a Sunday afternoon. And so he takes them to a farmer's field and he goes out metal detector. He doesn't have his glasses on, basically just showing them the ropes of it. And he goes and digs up this coin. And he doesn't know what it is. He can tell that it's gold, but he doesn't know what it is. So he puts it on Facebook. And of course, I see it on there, and I realise that it's one of the most spectacular coin finds ever made, one of the most important coins, because it's England's first gold coin, struck in this vanishingly small window in 1257, sort of as a crazy self-proposed plot by the king to sort of get rid of the problems instilled by Magna Carta. And bless him, the person who found it had no idea about it. He couldn't even tell what it was because he didn't have his glasses on. And so I pinched myself, because had there been any other scenario going on, I wouldn't have been on Facebook. I wouldn't have seen it. I remember very distinctly that weekend. That was when we had the petrol strike crisis here, and people were queuing up at petrol stations. And I remember distinctly having a call with my boss at the time saying, I know this is mad. I've got an auction in a couple of days' time, but I need to go and see this coin. I can't tell you how important this coin is, because this needs to be recorded. The British Museum needs to see this, and then we need to go from there. And he said, yeah, do whatever you need to do. And so I was like, right, I'm going to queue up for petrol. I'm going to do this. And so for me, weirdly, okay, it's connected directly with my field. It's a historic object, but it was the story around it that became so crazy and so wild that probably sticks in my mind most.
Yeah.
And of course, it goes and makes over £500,000 at auction. So I suppose, in a sense, Facebook posts can be quite valuable. So I suppose that's the ludicrous of it as well.
And if you could meet any of the kings or the queens featured on coins in the Carrington collection, who would it be and why?
This is such a complicated question, because you're dealing with coinage that spans the Plantagenets all the way through to the end of the House of Stuart. And I'm sure it doesn't take much imagination to put how many characters, how many names are in there. There are some wonderful individual stories where it's Henry III after Magna Carta, or whether it's this fascinating coin which is in the name of Edward V, one of the princes in the Tower, but has the initial mark, the boar's head of Richard III. And for me, if anything, I would want to know the person that made that and what was going through their head when they were connecting, where was the prince, but I'm putting the initial mark of Richard III. So I think, weirdly, my connection with that particular coin would be the person behind the coin rather than necessarily who was depicted on it. But I would think the one thing that probably surprises people most, and of course, when we look at historic palaces, a lot of the initials of earlier consorts, earlier queens of Henry VIII, are usually hidden or removed, with a few exceptions that people find. The coins are wonderful because for some reason Henry never learns his lesson. And so 5 out of the 6 consorts appear on Henry's coins. And you sometimes get these wonderful mulings where they've put the wrong head with the wrong tail. And so you end up with Catherine of Aragon muled with Jane Seymour, and you think, how on earth has that happened in the physical striking of the coin? But you've then got another scenario where you've got Queen 1 and Queen 3. And so I would love to meet those kind of individuals who made the coins, because they must have had some really fascinating. Was it just a Friday afternoon job and you didn't really care and you're knocking off for the weekend? Or was this actually some sort of subtle protest or subtle recognition of, no, she's the true queen, or, I'm not really in favor of, there are so many different discussions you could have. But I mean, if you were ultimately wanting to meet any one individual in history, and I'm sure Dr. Stiffel would hate me for this, I would love to just sort of follow the character of Elizabeth I, because I've seen some wonderful accounts of her court progress. And okay, she achieved a lot of what Mary could have done had Mary been on the throne longer. I'm sure that Mary popularized a lot of her achievements. But for her to go through the position of standing firm against the Armada, the portraiture, the encouragement of all the subsequent sort of the Royal Art Collection was basically started by her patronage of Charles Anstey and Derek Anstey in the 1590s, and some of the wonderful court jewels that you see in the Victoria and Albert Museum. I think in the round, she would probably be my target of interest and my person I'd like to have a conversation with, just because of the legacy she has, but also what she came from. I don't think you can beat that, unfortunately.
We're here to talk about the Carrington collection. So it's a remarkable collection of coins. It goes up for auction at the end of September. Introduce the collection for me. What's involved?
So, yes, I mean, it's 130 English gold coins. So the Carrington collection in its form follows a very traditional line of collectors who want to collect the very top of the market, the gold coins. And these 130 coins take you from the Dark Ages in about 700, when coinage typically had no lettering on it, no text, no legends, no association with any one body, all the way through until the end of the Tudors and the reign of Elizabeth I. And so in these 130 coins, you effectively have 130 stories, some of which are frustratingly porous in the narrative they tell you, because we don't even know who particularly issued them or where they were issued, with the Anglo-Saxon coins. Whereas, of course, those that are associated with Henry III, who starts the real English coin series in 1257, and then takes us through the Black Death with Edward III, who really popularizes the idea of having a bimetallic gold and silver currency system in the 1340s and 1350s. And then you have a natural progress through the familiar faces, Richard II of the Peasants' Revolt, Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, who, of course, usurped him, taking us all the way through the Wars of the Roses, and some wonderful coins of Edward IV. Richard III, as we mentioned before, and the Prince in the Tower, some wonderful coins with his personal insignia on. And then, of course, you through to the Tudors, when the interest for Carrington really exploded, and you get the number of denominations, the number of different types of coins within the Tudor period is remarkable and very surprising. And it's very easy for us to take coins out of the context and think that was the only thing that the people at the time encountered. They only saw a coin if they were English from England. Well, that wasn't the case. You had a lot of coins from the kings and queens of Scotland. You had, of course, coins from the continent. And, of course, you had a lot of influence from Castile and Aragon, when Ferdinand and Isabella, of course, their daughter came over and married Henry VIII. And so you see it in sight finds in the UK, but there were a lot of different coins circulating at the same time. And so, in a sense, in the same way that we have sort of a crowded Instagram feed or a social media feed now, you almost have different sort of images bombarding you at the same time. And so, in a sense, what you're trying to do is declutter and denoise that, but also put forward what is your statement, what is your brand identity. And that's very much what the Carrington collection shows. But it also reminds us that the Tudor period was frenetic in its problems with the economy, which famously got debased under King Henry VIII, the only king in English history who debased the sterling standard and got the nickname Old Copper-Nose as a result.
So the earliest coin, well, not the earliest if you're talking about the fact you've got Anglo-Saxon coins as well, but the earliest gold coin is the King Henry III. It's an item that's nearly 770 years old. So what can you tell me about it? And how do we know that this is the first gold coin in England?
Sure. So, as I say, since the Norman conquest, and it's very much the reason that William the Conqueror wanted to take the English throne after Edward the Confessor's demise in January 1066, was England was known and celebrated across continental Europe, even in the 11th century, for having an incredibly secure, an incredibly stable, and incredibly economically vibrant currency system. A sterling standard silver penny, which was pilfered by the Vikings, Danegeld, I'm sure people are familiar with, but was championed and was made to be regimented. And ever since that time, it was both it was a part of the political ladder that you, as a working or successful merchant in the 11th century, could get into favour with the monarch by being one of their money producers. So, of course, you paid a tax for doing it, but you could put your name on the coins. Now, that was a double-edged sword. Obviously, you got your profile out there, but you were also guaranteeing that that coin you were producing was of a sufficient standard. And if it wasn't of the sufficient standard, there would be severe penalties. You could have arms chopped off, hands chopped off. You could be made an example of. And the famous case that is in the reign of Henry I, when he has a third of his moneyers removed from office in one great show trial. In the 1250s, Henry has a big problem. Henry III has a big problem. He is obviously the first king to reign for 50 years. So you would think that he has stability. But of course, his reign is pockmarked with issues with Baron's Revolt, with Simon de Montfort and the Battle of Evesham, and of course the founding of Parliament in 1265. But he is the chief arbiter and the chief acceptor of Magna Carta. Of course, King John seals it, but doesn't really believe in it and dies very soon after it's implemented. And so Henry III is basically forced as a young man, a boy basically, until 1232 to continue ratifying this document. And his whole battle is fighting against this, fighting against the fact that he is king in name only. And one of the ways that he conjures up a way of championing his own authority. Firstly, is a great recoinage in 1247, when the silver pennies, because of these counterfeiters, because of continental imitations, because of course people are constantly wanting to undercut and imitate a celebrated sterling silver coinage by giving baser silver coins in, and also because you have unscrupulous moneyers that are getting into office and then are allowing coins to be clipped from circulation. And so a lot of the issues that we have with anti-Semitism and the Star of David, which we might very chargedly associate with the 1930s in Germany, is actually something that comes into Central Europe in the 1250s, 1290s. And so this is not a great period of English history, because we have the severe persecution of Jewish moneylenders who are centerfold blamed for the clipping and counterfeiting of coins, even though they're the people also bankrolling the English state at the time, because Christians famously can't be exchanging money for fear of committing usury. But Henry comes up with this crazy plan. That he needs to create a gold coinage to solve his money problems, to solve his political problems, and also to finance certain events that are happening in his life. So his son, Edward I, will go on to inherit the throne in 1272. But his second son, Prince Edmund, rather appropriately, my surname is Edmund, so rather a fascinating story for me, was earmarked to become the King of Sicily in 1254. Now, because the Kingdom of Sicily was a papal protectorate, and we love those popes who love their taxation in gold, the king had to form his own personal treasury of gold. And so he got taxes, his personal taxation, from those wanting to avoid jury duty, wanting to avoid other problems for having committed misdemeanors against the crown and wanting their royal pardons, paid the king directly in gold. And this went into what was known as the royal wardrobe, which, yes, it did contain wonderful furs and garments, but was actually basically his private purse. He used that money to try and effectively buy the Kingdom of Sicily and install his second son as an influential party in Europe in the mid-13th century. The problem was he didn't have enough money. He didn't have the power in Parliament to keep raising taxation. And of course, the more you do that, the more that you hack off your subjects, to the point that the barons that already have strong-armed him, one-armed behind his back, are going to say, well, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We've had the threat in 1216 of potentially installing a French king, Prince Louis. So we if we want to, we can just get rid of you. So he's really in this battle. And so this coin, this first English gold coin, is formed in a subtext of you haven't needed it economically for 250 years. And the English state is only really being formed with the Plantagenets, who've lost their claims in France but still want to claim them. But he produces it out of necessity for dealing with the papal problem. But subsequently, because he's exhausted his treasury, he then has a problem with Llewellyn ap Griffith and the Prince of Wales, the original Welsh Prince of Wales, who causes an uprising in 1257. And so Henry basically says, okay, all my gold treasury, I'm going to coin into coin, so I can pay for my forces to go and deal with the problem in Wales. And one of the coins that ended up being found by Michael E. Mallory down in Devon was on the landed estate of one of those people on campaign in 1257, which is a wonderful medieval connection. And we know that same individual bribed the king 6 months earlier to get out of jury duty. So it's a wonderful little historical story 750 years ago. But that's how we know the gold coinage was born by Henry III and conceived by him, but done completely without economic substance or need. It was done purely based on his own personal initiative, and there was no foundation for it.
There's also a gold noble struck for King Edward III. What was the value of a noble? What was this as a coin?
So its face value was 80 pence, which doesn't sound like it sounds like a strange amount, but what it was effectively a third of a pound being 240 silver pennies. And a noble was a princely sum. If we look at the general taxation, the average charge for 40 days of a knight's service on behalf of the king, which was taxation introduced in 1166, came to £4 per annum for 40 days service. So what you're looking at there is 12 gold nobles. So it is a princely sum for 40 days of work. It is something that the average labourer is never going to see. They would be lucky to see a quarter noble, a fourth of a noble. And you occasionally see in wills and grants and inventories in the 13 and 1400s people gifting almost their last amount of money, which is a quarter noble, to the church to make sure that the sacraments are done properly and that that their life is that their memory is preserved in the afterlife. But a noble is something that is only used by the very elite of society. The influencers, okay. The movers and shakers, the barons.
Yeah. And this coin was struck during a period known as the Black Death, the Plague, the Black Death. As best we can tell, did this impact the way that the coin was made or the value of it at that time?
It's a very, very good question. And it's something that I've often thought about because with the subtext of Henry III's failed economic gold experiment 90 odd years before, Edward III is really the first champion of a new gold coinage. And so in 1344, he devises his first coinage, which is a wonderfully titled leopard and a florin, which are very much inspired by his personal insignia. The leopard is the archaic English name for the lion. And so the three lions in your shirt that you see with football comes from his popularization of that. And he's very much romancing St. George and the dragons. There's a lot of allegory and mythology that comes into the first coinage. The problem is he fails in the same way that Henry III had failed before him. He produced a coinage that wasn't essentially needed, even though there was pressure from Central Europe to have a gold coinage, a bimetallic system. And so within 6 months of his first coinage in 1344, it flops. He tries again in 1346, and this is really where it hits the schism, which is the Black Death. This, for our modern equivalent, it's the sort of the pre-coronavirus, post-coronavirus era. The Black Death is a major, major upheaval of European society. Estimates put between 40 and 50% of living individuals perished in the Black Death, a massive social upheaval. And what's so surprising is the fact that this coinage, which is started in 1346, survives and continues to 1351 and beyond and becomes the most successful English gold coin for the next century. And so outwardly, you would say the Black Death had no real impact on the economy because this coinage survived as a spending unit. But that is not actually looking at the technical detail. The coinage actually drops 12 grains, about a gram of gold, in weight between 1346 and 1351. That is a clear sign of the devaluation as a result of price changes. And famously in 1351, obviously as a result of the social upheaval and the fact that those who had survived the Black Death subsequently had so many job opportunities because a lot of communities had been decimated and people needed the agricultural economy to keep going, they felt like they were free agents. And so a lot of the price controls that Edward III brings in 1351 is to try and put the thumb and the boot back down on those that had been used to pre-Black Death society but now had the economic liberation of, well, I can go and offer my services and get a better rate. And so in a strange way, you've got this mashing of the royal force against the actual economic and social need, and so this coinage interplays beautifully with that. And the moment, which is probably the greatest national threat, probably in English history, that half of society is just gone.
So amazingly, there's a number of Anglo-Gallic coins as well, including something highly significant for Edward of Woodstock, the son of Edward III. So what's the story here around this particular coin?
Yeah, I mean, it's we probably better know him as Edmund the Black Prince, which is probably one of the coolest epithets you're going to have of any royal subject. And sadly, of course, as the son of Edward III, he never becomes king. It's his own son, Richard II, who comes king after Edward's death in 1376. And so the Anglo-Gallic protectorate, the duchies of Anglo-Gaul, which we would know as modern France, is very much born out of the 100 Years' War. After 1346, of course, Edward III has vanquished the royal French crown at the Battle of Crécy, and this is the famous sort of celebration of the English longbowman versus the Turkish archer and the crossbowman of of France. And what that enables the king to do is basically usurp the royal crown and re-establish the Plantagenet claim to French areas, duchies. And so Brabant, which has always been aligned with English causes in the Low Countries, but also Burgundy, Aquitaine, all areas that have been associated with the Plantagenet dynasty going all right back to the Norman conquest, suddenly come under the English control again. And Edward probably forward-thinkingly recognizes that the way to establish legacy and authenticity to his claim is to use his son as the issuing authority for the coinage. So although he starts the first coinage in 1350 in his own name, by 1360, with the installation of the Black Prince, Edward the Black Prince is issuing coins in his own name. And so for coin collectors, this is the only time you can get a coin in the name of the Black Prince. So you have to go to Anglo Gaul to do it. But from a collector's point of view, it's the romance of having a key name in English history, a fetid but fateful name because he never becomes king, ruling over central France at a time of great tumult, and of course within a generation of the Battle of Crécy during the 100 Years' War. And so from that point of view, it's this wonderful narrative of sort of familial association, and obviously the start of what would centuries later become the British Empire, but of the English might. And that's really started with Edward III. But of course, what he's focusing on doing there is establishing his claim and his right by putting his son into a position of issuing coins so that the French are familiar with it when the time comes for him to become, obviously, King of England and France.
So we're now talking about coins that have spanned over 100 years. Did the representation of kings on the coins over the different periods take on different appearances, or was it pretty uniform, I suppose?
It's a very good question. What is very noticeable about the medieval period, and I'm talking the ruling dynasty of the Plantagenets, from the coinage that is established by Edward I in 1279, all the way through to the coinage of Richard III, there is a very familiar theme. And by that, I mean there is a long cross and 12 soul pellets on the reverse of all of the silver coinage, whether it's the halfpenny coin, the penny coin, the 2-penny coin, or the 4-penny coin. And so there is a unifying feature. So you'd be forgiven if you couldn't read or you couldn't tell the stylistic portrait differences, that you'd be looking at a coin in 1300 that would look exactly the same in 1450. And so there is a clear standard. We like sort of subtle changes on the £20 note, but it still looks purple. It's the right size. It's that kind of thought process. But for coin specialists, obviously, a lot of the work that we do, because we don't have a physical date on a coin, and often Edwards weren't helpful because we have Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI. They didn't think to put, well, I'm Henry VI, so I'm going to put Henry VI on the coins. We have to put that information on them based on what we can extrapolate of the stylistic details, the mint marks, the things that moneyers are putting on the coins, or in some instances, was Calais actually being used as a coin mint for the English at the time this coin is professing to be made? And so you have all of these subtle little things that you have to pick up because the coins themselves don't actually tell you. So
is there any way that, on that subject, is there any way that metal can be aged in the way that wood can, or is that not possible?
So this is probably the forefront of numismatic science and scholarly research. Archaeometallurgy, which would cover this domain, has not been used in any great respect to identify medieval numismatics, but is very much being used in Roman numismatics. And so clearly, if that path works there, it should work on a medieval principle. But of course, that would rely on us being able to identify what is a new source of silver. Let's say it's coming from Devon or it's coming from Wales, versus a homogeneous mix of, recycled metals, recycled material. And probably one of the greatest achievements of medieval England is the fact that it's so successful in recycling metal and getting, coins that have been clipped down to be reissued, restruck at the full weight and the full standard. And obviously there are exceptions, and obviously there's a much higher premium if you're going to be clipping gold coins than if you're clipping silver coins. And the Carrington collection wonderfully illustrates how the constant battle between the royal economy and what people are doing to get money out of the royal economy over 1350 to 1450, beautifully testified in the coins in the Carrington collection, is a possibility there, but it will probably actually show us just how effective the medieval operator was in recycling.
Another rare item is the Edward IV gold noble that you've got. And this was part of, it was a sort of big collection of coins that were found, I believe. Is that correct?
Anyone who's familiar with room 68 in the British Museum will be familiar with a magnificent spread of over 1,000 gold nobles on a table known as the Fishpool hoard. And it is the biggest medieval coin hoard ever found in Britain. Over 1,200 English gold coins, gold nobles, each 80 pence coins. This is a mammoth amount. This is going to be someone at the very highest of society, if not within the royal circle, who has buried this hoard around the time of the Wars of the Roses in the 1460s. Curiously, and of course before the Treasure Act of 1996, the way that hoards and finds of hoards were reported was such that on occasion hoards could be claimed by the Crown, and by extrapolation they'd go into the British Museum or another local institution, or they could be disclaimed. And prior to 1996, we have many scenarios of hoards of coins being disclaimed or partially claimed, whereas today, if an archaeological find were made or a metal detectives made a discovery, it's almost certain that a hoard of this size would be claimed by the Crown and will be in a museum. But the Fishpool hoard, effectively 100 coins from the Fishpool hoard, were offered for sale in 1968. And what's so remarkable about the Fishpool hoard, because it was deposited in this 1460, 1470 window, is it has this remarkable parcel of very early Edward IV coins. Now, we don't really remember this period in history other than saying the Wars of the Roses, but actually we had the flip-flopping, thanks to Warwick the Kingmaker, between Henry VI being deposed in 1461, the Yorkist faction of Edward IV having his first reign, him then being deposed, and then Henry VI coming back, and then Edward IV having a second reign. And obviously, and unsurprisingly, when a country is ravaged by war for 20 or 30 years, the economy suffers. And so when Edward IV comes in, his first act, obviously, is to stamp his authority, and so he does so with the coinage, but economic forces outstrip his ability to spread his message. And so in the first 3 years, he starts a great recoinage of scrying down the value, increasing the commercial spending power of the coins. So the gold noble goes from 6 shillings and 8 pence to 10 shillings, a massive uplift given the economy that it's in. But as a result, his noble coinage, which is struck in this 3-year window, is extremely rare. Very few were struck in the first place, and very few examples have survived to the present day outside of the Fishpool hoard. And so for us to have a coin that comes directly from the most celebrated medieval gold coin hoard, but also is of such an important and such a small snapshot in the story of the Wars of the Roses, is wonderful. And this coin is perfectly preserved. It's like it has just been made, but it's something that is 600 years old and from an amazingly charged period in English history. It's wonderful, a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it in the flesh at some point soon. You also have a Richard III angel, and you touched on this earlier briefly. There's either the name of Edward IV, although based on what you said, Edward V more likely. So what's the story here, and what was an angel?
So the gold angel was the ultimate replacement of the gold noble, and right. As I mentioned, that the gold noble goes from being worth 6 shillings and 8 pence, 80 pence in 1464, to suddenly being worth 10 shillings. So it's 120 pence. That's a 50% uplift in value given the size of the coin. But because the economy is used to a 6 shilling and 8 pence coin, they suddenly realised, well, we don't need to make a 10 shilling coin now. What we need to make is a 6 shilling 8 pence coin, but we don't have the value of metals to do that, so we need to create a new coin. And so we go from a design which, you mentioned earlier, could you tell the differences in design? With the gold noble, the design was cemented based on England's first naval victory over the French in 1340 at the Battle of Sluis. And you have a king depicted standing in a ship, showing off his military prowess. And whether you're Edward III, Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, or Henry VI, and Edward IV, you look exactly the same, basically. But what they designed is a 6 shilling 8 pence coin to replace the noble, but of an economic value commensurate with the prices at the time, that has St. Michael the Archangel on it. And this coin becomes known
Right.
as the angel because it has this wonderful depiction of good versus evil, the archangel vanquishing the dragon. And it's something that's subsequently used in the touching of the king's and queen's sickness, as a coin that sort of has this resonant mythological power to sort of cure people of ills and ailments. But fundamentally, it's economic.
Oh, touching to the king's evil.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
But this coin is born out of Edward IV in 1464, and is readopted by Henry VI and subsequently becomes popularized. So by the onset of Richard III's reign in 1483, you have this new economic unit, the replacement of the noble, which is called the Gold Angel. And this is where you start to get the flexing, the influence, the personal influences or the personal insignia of royalty coming through. And yes, there are examples during Bolingbroke's usurpation in 1399 of him using the personal mark of his crescent, which sometimes appears on his coinage. But really, with Richard III, you see his personal insignia, and everyone knows it. It's the boar's mark, and he starts using that on his coinage, very much as a clear message of this is my authority at work. But of course, what you're dealing with is the social upheaval and the royal upheaval of a claim to the throne, illegitimate or legitimate as it may have been perceived at the time, but the practical implications of producing a coinage. Now, what we haven't mentioned is all these coins are handmade. And so this requires hand puncheons, hand stamping. You don't have the benefit of magnification. You don't have the benefit of mechanization. You're doing this by hand. And so in some instances, you see sheerly the practical implications of hand producing coinage. And so we have here a coin that it's possible it's a coin that's been a leftover head die or matrix of Edward IV angel that's been restamped with a pix mark of Richard III, but still bears the name of Edward. And so reasonably, if you were striking that, you could think, is this Edward V or is this still Edward IV, if you can read? Or is this simply a mistake just done by the moneyer at the time who's just going, oh, I'm knocking out whatever's the order is, but I've still got a coin that I'm going to use because it's still functioning, but so I don't want to destroy the die and waste my work. So it's unclear. And a lot of the numismatic study that's been done over what are the coins that are actually of Edward V, the Prince in the Tower, is down to the linguistic analysis and a group of heads and tails dies that appear to have been made after his elevation to the throne and that potentially were struck. But it's unclear. And so what you're left with here is this just a practical reuse of a serviceable head die with Richard III's new insignia on it, or is this actually a very, very charged moment in history where you've got the direct usurpation of Edward V by his uncle appearing on a coin? And that's a wonderful discussion topic because, again, we've got all these fleeting romance mentions of what happened to the Prince in the Tower, but here is something emblazoned on a coin that potentially is going to have that exact discussion on it.
Yeah, very much. And excitingly, you also have some amazing coins from the reign of King Henry VII, including 3 gold sovereigns, which is a new currency that we've not mentioned yet. What can this tell us about the significance of Henry Tudor's economy?
I mean, it shows how successful he was at managing the finances, and the impression that we get if we look at royalty in general, we think of profligacy. We think of the likes of George IV spending the public purse and bankrupting the economy but making Buckingham Palace. He leaves behind a legacy of wonderful things, but he spends the public purse doing it. Same is very true of Henry VIII. All of his wonderful, majestic palaces, Whitehall, Bewley, you can rattle off the names, Hampton Court, which he claims obviously from the Cardinal, and expands. But what you get with Henry VII is a very different story. He's rather unromantically known as the Winter King. He's very much perceived as a miser. He taxes everyone to the hilt, and he ensures that the economy he passes on to his son in 1509 is incredibly successful because he's managed it so well, and he's ensured that economic leashes that he's put around all his barons, all those that potentially could be a threat to him, not least because he's in a shaky situation, even though he's married Elizabeth of York, in where he is actually on the throne. And of course, it's easy to remember the likes of Perkin Warbeck as pretenders to the throne or people potentially coming back and threatening his charge. So he very much revolutionizes and uses the financial system as a weapon and a crutch to beat down those that potentially could be threats to him. And as a result, his management is ultimately successful from our point of view because he introduces this majestic new coinage in 1489, the gold sovereign, which is still the spending coin of today. And when he originally devised it, it was a 20 shilling coin, a pound coin. But it's very clear what he's doing with that. It's very much a departure from any visual narrative that's been displayed before. The medieval period is always about continuity, and we've discussed that. If you didn't
Yeah.
read the text or you didn't really identify the individual personal characteristics of Richard II versus Edward III, you'd be able to look at the coins and go, okay, this is continuity. This is just Plantagenet Part 2. When it comes to Henry VII, it's a very clear departure. Not only has he produced a brand new coin that has never been seen before in the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, France, wherever it is, but he's also put his own insignia, him enthroned. It's him sitting on the royal throne, surrounded by every conceivable Tudor image that you can think of. The Beaufort portcullis, the doubled rose, everything is there. And of course, his personal insignia of the griffin and the dragon, the royal supporters that we're now oh so familiar with coats of arms. All of that is started by them. And it's something that is the ultimate, the most successful legacy of the Tudors because we still see it today. You know, the portcullis of Margaret Beaufort was still on the English penny until 2008. The Tudor rose was still on the 20 pence until 2008. So in terms of what he achieves with the coinage of 1489, it's something that is still resonant in our pockets today, nearly 500 years, over 500 years later. And so that's really the change that happens. It goes much like in the Roman Republic, where it goes from Republic to Julius Caesar. Henry VII is very much at the vanguard of the change from the royal identity or the right hand of God to being, this is my charge, this is my image. And you see that emblazoned on the coinage. And there are very rare survivors because they didn't have much gold to use to produce. And a lot of them that were produced were deliberately made for those within the royal court to go, you're taking this from me, but you know where it's coming from. And that's very clear on the coins. So it's wonderful to hold them, but it comes at a very important cultural shift in English history as well. And that's what the coinage tells.
Amazing. So you also have a Henry VIII George Noble.
Yeah.
This was quite unique and struck at a significant time. So tell me about this particular coin.
Yeah, so again, this goes back to the counterplay between the noble evolving to the angel. And again, by 1526, there is an absence in the value of 6 shillings and 8 pence. For some reason, the English economy, the legal system, was still wedded to having an 80 pence coin. And so in 1526, Cardinal Wolsey is put in charge of recoining the English monetary system, which was sort of needed every 20, 50, 80 years to ensure that currency that was in circulation wasn't being too clipped down, wasn't being impoverished, wasn't being exported and causing a crisis in England, because, of course, the thing that every continental ruler in Europe did was they continually debased their coins. And so as a result, there was a constant outflow of metal. And so a lot of the imitations and coinage you see in Flanders, in Belgium, is inspired by the coinage of the late medieval period. And so there are, in Grincham, there are copies of Edward IV gold rials and gold nobles from the 1460s being used in the 1500s. And so putting that in context, you have this need for a recoinage of 1526, obviously just after the fields of cloth of gold. So I have no doubt in the back of Henry's mind, he's also thinking, how can I save a few quid here as well? And so he gets Cardinal Wolsey to do this. And what's surprising about it is this is Henry's first appearance on his own coinage. So although he's put his name Henry VIII, he's the first one to put Henry VIII, finally, we like Henry, on his coinage in 1509. He uses, for all of his silver coinage, he still uses the portrait of his father, which I think is very telling and goes back to this view of the management of the economy. People clearly saw with Henry VII the image of authority, the image of authenticity, but also of good, sound coinage. And so in effect, Henry VII's profile becomes a hallmark and a standard of excellence for money. And for 15 years, even though Henry VIII has gone through his first marriage, the death of Prince Henry after 10 days, he's gone through this wonderful period of his own life with challenges and a mixture aplenty. He doesn't change his portrait on his coinage. He doesn't appear on his coinage. And so 1526 is this seismic shift because he's got Cardinal Wolsey in check making the coins, but he appears for the first time. So his silver coinage, the stuff that everyone's going to see, here's his fluffy, juvenile, very sort of adolescent, attractive young Prince of Europe vibe for his silver coinage. But for his gold coinage, he goes, What can I do? And so this is where he goes back to the playing on the mythology. And it's never quite clear when he actually becomes king. It's around the 22nd, 23rd of April. There's a banquet and he hears obviously of the death of his father and that he's to be king. And I think that's what ultimately conjures this image of the George Noble. Because you would think that with a coin that is valued at 80 pence is going to be something that the higher echelons of society are going to see, you're probably going to put your face on it because it's kind of
Yeah.
establishing you. But he doesn't do that. He decides instead to put the image of St. George and the Dragon. And I think that's a really interesting side event in Henry's reign, where he's allowing mythology to overtake him. And yes, his name appears alongside it, but we're only appreciating that because we can read and visually contextualize it. If you just see
Yeah.
this coin in the round, it's this remarkable oddity that it doesn't have him on it, but it's got St. George and the Dragon. I think it, if you're reading into it, and I like to do that with these particularly, I'm thinking the message he's trying to send is, I am the next version of St. George, the patron saint, and that's what I'm trying to popularize. But what is fascinating is the reception, and we actually have contemporary accounts of people trying to pursue this very coin because it's so unusual, it's so bizarre that we even have the agent for the uncle of Henry VIII going out and willing to pay £2 or £3 for a coin worth 80 pence to have an example because he hasn't found one. So we know they must have been made in pretty short supply, but also that literally at the moment they were struck, they became collector's items. And so it's a really interesting sort of identity. Does Henry realize this? Does he know this? Or is this something that becomes popularized afterwards? And so this wonderful account from Agent Hussey for the uncle of Arthur, for Arthur Plantagenet, agent to Arthur
Yeah.
Plantagenet, of Mayor of Calais. And he says, try and find me one of these coins. I'll pay him £3 for it. That's in 1538, only 12 years after the coin is struck. And so potentially Henry VIII is also the champion of the collector English coin.
So you touched on this very briefly earlier, but Henry is obviously famous as the man who marries 6 wives. He has 6 queen consorts. And you mentioned briefly that 5 of Henry's wives play roles in coinage. So in what way?
So this is a wonderful discussion I've had with Professor David Starkey about it. Is what lesson was not learned when it came to employing the royal ciphers? And of course, the Tudor dynasty is dominated, at least in its first half, by this identity crisis, this need to display every aspect of their brand in order for people to associate and understand, okay, who's in charge, what's the connection? And so on the minor gold coinage, and also for the coinage of Ireland as well, when Henry is producing coinage, the silver coinage, there is a clear lineage of coinage that is struck for Henry and Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. And that obviously is around the time of Cardinal Wolsey's recoinage in 1526. And so you have the George Noble is emblazoned on one side with H for Henry and K for Catherine. Now, Anne Boleyn features as H and A, and we see coins beautifully that are muled on one side HK and on the other side HA. And so you know that that's obviously the connection between wife 1 and consort 1 and consort 2. The ones that are obviously the most charged are the ones for Jane Seymour, H and I, because there wasn't a Latin J, there was an I that was used. And
Yes.
those are the coins that you clearly are they're the most abundant, and no surprise of that, because there must have been a numismatic celebration of the birth of the boy king, Edward VI. And obviously there wasn't so much of a celebration for Catherine providing Princess Mary, or of course Anne providing Princess Elizabeth, and that's much later that comes on. But the discussion I had with David Starkey was very much, why did they keep doing this if we know at Hampton Court they deliberately removed the effigies and ciphers or the marks of previous consorts that had been effectively deposed, whether by divorce or by beheading on Tower Hill? And the simple answer was love. You see it through all of Henry's papers and all of his journals that survive, he is a very romantic person, very captivated by love in a way that bleeds into aspects of the royal life. And of course, in a functional sense, coinage is not going to become devalued the moment that a previous monarch disappears or a previous consort disappears. And so the practical implications overtake it. So if there are dies and heads and matrices that have been produced with the effigies and collaborations, probably a better expression to use, of monarch 1 with consort 1 or monarch 1 with consort 2 or monarch 1 with consort 3, you're just going to use them because they're functional things. And, unless you're following the court progress and understanding who's the queen this week, you're not really going to worry too much. But for us as numismatists, it's wonderful because we're seeing this dynamic interplay between the society at the very top and the practical implications of we need the money in the economy. And so it really helps us, again, because we don't have dates on the coins. This really helps us to cover the periods and changes in the coinage. And although Henry VIII establishes a lot of principles, of course, he becomes defender of the faith. He establishes the claims to France that is reutilized on all the coins until George III. A lot of numismatic disciplines that are established going forward under Henry VIII. What he doesn't do is he doesn't date his coinage. That comes in with Edward VI. And so it leaves us with these frustrating 20-year periods where we're guessing a lot of things. And so having the ciphers is very useful for us to be able to benchmark when a coin die was produced and therefore when a series was produced. But yeah, he does it 5 times remarkably. And the last time I love, he just puts HR, Henricus Rex. There is no mention of the last wife. It's just Henricus Rex. And that's the last one that fades out his reign. So yeah, he learns by number 6.
So there are a few coins in the collection as well from the reign of Queen Mary I, some also featuring Philip of Spain, her husband. I'd like to start by focusing on the Mary sole reign half angel. So can you describe it for me and its significance really in Tudor numismatics?
Yeah, so when we think of coinage, we obviously think about them as machine made, easy things to knock out on a steam press. Or electrical press nowadays. Back then, everything was handmade. And so the practical implications of producing a fractional denomination, by which I mean there is the noble, there is the angel, there is the groat. Why are you going to produce a half groat or a half angel or a half noble? Because you're using the same amount of effort to strike the coin as you are on a full angel, as you are a half angel. And so as a result, you have this bizarre dichotomy, which is the economy is obviously going to want smaller denominations more. There's a reason there are billions of pennies in circulation, but not billions of pound coins, because people need the smaller denominations over the larger. But the practical implications are you're going to strike fewer of the small ones because it takes as much effort and you're getting less out at the other end. And so the surviving rates for things like half angels or angelés, the French expression that they were dubbed, during Mary's reign is extraordinarily scarce. And I think also, even though you get these coinage decrees, which very much in black and white say, you are authorized to produce such a coin under my likeness, my effigy. Actually, it hits the practicalities of, okay, we're authorized to, but are we actually going to do it? No, we'll produce the full angels, we'll produce the things that are of use, but half angels largely fall by the wayside. But this design, again, it has the Archangel Michael vanquishing the dragon. And again, this is a wonderful demonstration of numismatic craftsmanship more than anything, because you're doing the exact same design, but you're doing it on half the scale, half the size of coin. And so to do that without magnification, to do that with hand punches and steel tools is a magnificent demonstration of Tudor craftsmanship. Of that, there is no doubt. And it probably is the case that the Milanese engraver Jacopo de Trezzo, who is employed to produce the tete-a-tete portraits which are used on the silver coinage of Mary facing Philip after their union in 1554, almost certainly influenced a lot of the engravership that you see in the gold. But what is very interesting on the gold coinage is Mary is very much the continuity queen. She wants to establish a lot of the old standards, a lot of the things that have been ruptured and broken by Henry VIII and Edward VI. And so by producing the half angel, what she's effectively doing is turning back the clock 50, 60 years to the Plantagenets, the last sort of link in the chain. And half angels were very much more available in the reign of Edward IV than they were in the reigns of Henry VII, Henry VIII, or even Edward VI, who basically towards the end of the 1540s and during the reign of Edward VI, they dispensed with them altogether. And so what Mary is doing effectively by producing this coin is we're going back to a lot of the old established order, both both with religion but also with coinage. But we're doing so in a way that celebrates that history without making it too much about me. So her name appears, but the design is exactly the same as it was from 75 years before. Again, very much the Plantagenet ethos. But it carries with it loaded psalms. It's very Christian in its imagery and in its focus. You have a crucifix emblazoned on a ship. It's very clear what the nation statehood of this country is. It's very clear how Mary associates that. Her name, the M of her insignia, and the rose of the Tudor dynasty beneath the crucifix. It's very clear what they're trying to say with this. And so in one sense, it's the same as before. In another sense, it's her establishment of her sole reign as queen in her own right after she's vanquished the Lady Jane Grey issue. She's established herself as, she has no forebears to go by. Okay, Isabella of Spain as possibly her grandmother as a forebear, but really, even Queen Matilda, Empress Maud, doesn't really have. So this is very much her way of establishing a lot staying the same, but a lot is changing under me. It's very interesting, that interplay you see on the coin.
Well, there's also then on the flip side of that, you have a joint reign coin of Mary and Philip. I'm just curious with that, were there subtle means taken in the composition of this coin to portray Mary as the senior party in England?
Yeah. So on the gold coinage, the most telling feature is Philip doesn't feature at all. So there is no effigy used of Philip on any of the gold coinage. His name appears, and it appears before Mary's because there is an element King of Spain. That there is a sort of a compromise that's arranged. But I think also there's probably a linguistic device at play here, which is if we think of the expression tic-tac-toe, I-A-O, Philip and Mary tends to follow and bleed into the way we say it. We don't tend to say Mary and Philip. It doesn't sound right. But even though she was the queen sua jure in her own right in England, it should really be Mary and Philip on the coins. But actually it's Philip et Maria. But the way they get around that is they then don't display his effigy on the gold coinage. So the angels and half angels that are produced under Philip and Mary are exactly the same as the sole reign angels and half angels. But the gold sovereign, which Mary follows on from her father, is just a depiction of her. And she only produced that under her sole reign. She doesn't produce that under the joint reign. So she gets around that sort of creatively. But very tellingly about the positioning of the effigies. There is very much a nod to her Spanish roots on the silver coinage. The sixpence and shilling, which aren't featured in the Carrington collection, but are the defining features of that 4-year period, are beautifully struck, clearly very carefully produced, but done so with a clear homage and a clear nod to the tête-à-tête portraits you see of Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile and Aragon in 1500, in the way that she is depicted on the left, he on the right. She is clearly, if you look at it, elevated slightly in her profile as well. And so the other way they get around it, even though it says Philip and Mary on the coinage, the English titles come first. And it's the Neapolitan titles that come later, and they're sometimes even ignored on the coins. So there are a variety of coins which just have the English and French claims that Mary has, nothing to do with Philip. There are some that have his Neapolitan claims as well. So I think that's both a mixture of gentle political massaging going on at respect of the various claims that are being made. But I think also, and certainly the reception that you get with the coinage, because there are both Catholic and Protestant causes that are in equal measure defacing and removing the portraits of Mary and Elizabeth at that time. I think there's probably a subtle nod by the English moneyers going, he's not really our king, but we'll do it anyway. And so you see that by elevating her position just a bit, because Mary's very popular, Philip not so much. And so that's that subtle little nod that you can just about get away with. And I think that's what you see on the coins.
In what I'm sure is one of the standout pieces of the collection, you have a coronation sovereign from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, as this is a coronation coin, did it differ from other Elizabethan coinage at that moment in Elizabeth's reign?
Strangely, no, it doesn't. The thing that defines it as the coronation issue is the privy mark, the mint mark that is used, which is the French fleur de lis, which is the first used during the reign of Elizabeth I, which obviously starts on the 17th of November 1558. And the defining feature of that, she's at Hatfield House, she's in the gardens under the oak tree, and of course she proclaims the 118th Psalm. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. And that is the feature that appears on the back of this coin, the 118th Psalm. Now, when I've discussed it with Peter, of course, the very obvious point is Mary had already used that psalm 5 years earlier. So Elizabeth wasn't really doing anything new by saying this on the coinage. But what makes this unique is, of course, Elizabeth is faced with a lot of the same problems that Mary faced. Although Elizabeth, of course, has had her stint in the Tower of London by this point, she sort of had to hide her religious fervour in order to survive and outlive the Marian rule. And so, from that point of view, this is about really establishing Elizabeth's feature within the royal family, not necessarily a monarch that is female. But obviously, you see a lot of the interplay. You know, Mary is known for, if you cut open my heart, you'll see Calais engraved on it. Elizabeth does exactly the same thing with the sort of the masculine language she portrays around the Tilbury Dock speech. So you see this very much need to be seen to be masculine, first and foremost, and obviously very quickly into her reign, she says that she's not going to marry; she's wedded to the kingdom, or queendom, as we should more appropriately call it. So the coin itself is not so remarkable, but it's remarkable in the sense that it is the only survivor from that sort of 6 month schism after she becomes queen and starts to establish herself. And so, in terms of what that means for numismatists, it's a very, very special thing. You know, it's something that even the British Museum does not have an example of. And people may well fair ask the question, well, why isn't it in the British Museum? Well, that's the dint of private collectors and private interest in some cases. And there's nothing to say that private collectors might not want to loan it to the British Museum or gift it to the British Museum. That might well happen after this sale. But in terms of what it means for us as historians, if we're looking at it from that research angle, it is not unremarkable, but it is equally remarkable for its context within its struck. And so it's sort of a symbol of more of the same, but also here's Elizabeth, what's going to happen next.
So there's also an Elizabethan gold real struck to pay mercenaries during the wars of the 1580s. That's a coin we've also not mentioned yet.
Yeah.
What is a real?
So again, this is another one of these anachronistic issues during the Elizabethan period, and I'm thinking off the top of my head there are at least 20 or 25 different denominations within Elizabethan England that she is responsible for producing, either because she's taking down coins from the medieval period that have become debased or clipped, or she's establishing a new currency system which is absurdly fractional and absurdly complicated. But the golden real that she produced in 1584 through 1588 is entirely born out of the crisis in the Spanish Netherlands and her need to support Prince Maurice of Orange, the last bastion of Protestant virtue within an entirely Catholic Europe. So you can see from her political persuasion, she is a Protestant queen, unmarried, and previously having some flirtations with the French prince in the early 1580s, who she delightfully referred to as the Frog.
Frog.
So you can see where she's sort of sitting in this position. She's imperiled by Philip II, who's confused why all his advances have gone. You know, she needs to be removed because she is the threat to the Catholicism at the edge of Europe. But she's also needing to pump money into the Netherlands as the last bastion of Protestantism in Europe. And so, what is the coinage she selects? It is basically another hangover of the medieval period. The gold royale is another name for the noble, but more associatedly, what happened towards the end of Edward IV's first reign is he struck nobles at this inflated value of 10 shillings, but he struck a rose on them at the time. So even though the Tudor rose is what we think about, Edward IV actually struck roses on them in the 1460s. And those rose nobles, or rials as they became known, floated around the economic and merchant centres of the Low Countries, Belgium, Flanders, that area, and they were very much integrated within the economic system of the Netherlands 100 years later. And so what she was doing with this is striking a coin, which is wonderful. Elizabeth, of course, is the queen we think about when we think about nautical successes before Wellington and Nelson, of course, is she is depicted in a ship, a Tudor galleon, in the style of a medieval coin in order to pay mercenaries who are fighting the Protestant corner against the Spanish influx into the Netherlands of Philip II of Spain. And so it is entirely mercenary money that is being struck in England by the English Exchequer to pay Dutch mercenaries to fight, and of course under the Earl of Leicester later, English mercenaries to fight for Protestant cause. And so very, very few of these things survive. They're not intended really to be English currency, even though they were valued on the English currency system. And for us, the romance of, coins often feel very, very removed from any other mental image we have of royalty. When we think about Elizabeth I, we think about the Armada portrait. When we think about Henry VIII, we
Yeah.
think about Holbein. Fantastic imagery. The Tudors are really the only time where we have that direct connection between how we see them in art and how we see them on coins. And the Ryle of Elizabeth I is exactly that. It's if you wanted anything, it's the Armada Queen in a ship with her breastplate on, standing up for English values. And that's what that coin is.
I see. Okay. So my final question for you then is, and I'm sure it's a very hard one to pick, but which of the coins is your favorite?
That is probably even harder than saying who do I want to beat from history. Because for me, over the decade or so that I've been doing this job at Spink, the thing that has really come to define my interest is not necessarily handing these amazing pieces of history, which they are, and I'm never that's never lost
Mm,
on me. But for me, it's almost the second life of these things. And what I mean by that is, who has owned these things beforehand? How have they come to survive for 500 years? Where have they been? And we've talked about the fishbowl hoard, amazing hoard, lost for 500 years and dug up in the 1960s. But I look at some of these coins. There's a wonderful pattern of a coin for Edward VI, which is probably my personal favourite because it's been something that's been so finicky to catalogue, but has ultimately been so rewarding to find out about. And it's a coin of which there are probably half a dozen known, most of which are in museums, either at the Royal Mint Museum in Clantrisant or in the British Museum, rightly so. And it's very unclear why it was struck. Was it struck with the intention of being the boy Kim coming out as king in his own right? Was it struck to celebrate his 10th birthday? Was it some trial that was being done by engravers to show, look, this is what we can do? Not quite clear, but
yeah.
clearly done very, very beautifully and very, very adeptly by the engraver, who sadly we don't know either. But this particular coin has, other than the provenance to which I was provided, which was it was bought from a sale in 1961, there was no prior provenance for it. Meticulously going through every annotation, every note that I can find over our fantastic numismatic library, which is 200 years in age and has wonderful, unique notes in it from all the sales that our forebears and my predecessors have made of auctions that have been and gone, is we managed to associate this particular coin through the sales of the most famous and celebrated collectors of Tudor coinage in 1896 and in 1901. And later it was owned by the presidents of the Royal Society of Antiquaries. So you cannot get a better name association for a coin in its second life. Even though we don't know why it was struck, we know who has celebrated it since. And so for me, I think that's probably the one that I would pick because I think the artistic elements are
Mm,
there. The flourishing of the Tudor rose is this wonderful romantic wrapping up of Tudor history. But the fact that I now know that that particular coin was owned by some of the greatest names, the people that are my forebears, and the people by whom I've come to sort of
yeah.
respect, and the reason why I do the job I do. And so, yeah, probably quite a nice note to end on that it's nothing to do with the coin itself, but who's owned it since.
Yeah, which is again, it's sort of the other half of the story, isn't it, really? It's what happens to these coins after they go out of circulation and end up being found in fields across the country. That's all part of the charm, I guess. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and discussing this remarkable collection. I take it this is, well, it's possible that whoever ends up buying this collection, they might go on public display at some point.
Yeah, I mean, so the way that we're going to offer it, we're going to obviously offer each coin individually rather than as a whole collection, but it will be over the course of
Okay.
20 lots. And we'll certainly do some displays of them in advance to sale. We'll certainly obviously have a catalogue produced, so there'll be a legacy so that anyone that wants to read about them can see it online, or they can order a
Mm,
catalogue from us at our website. But yes, for me, ultimately, if I can find someone that wants to put these on display and celebrate them the way that we have discussed over the last hour or so, I think
yeah,
that'd be wonderful. I think that'd be absolutely
absolutely.
wonderful.
Yeah. So if people want to keep up to date with what you do, are you personally across social media talking about your work at Spink?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I am absolutely on all the social media channels. You can find me on LinkedIn at Gregory Edmund. Very easy to find me there. Same on Instagram, and very easy to contact me. I'm very happy to have an open discussion, even if it's nothing to do with numismatics, but generally Tudor history or connections that it has. Because I have lots of friends who work in the archaeology sector. You can just drop me an email at gedmund@spink.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast. And you and I will be meeting each other in the flesh hopefully quite soon so that I can see these coins as well.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me on, Adam. I'll look forward to seeing you soon.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Gregory for coming onto the show to discuss the Carrington collection with me. In next week's show, I'm speaking to historian and author Beverly Adams about her upcoming book, The Race for Elizabeth I's Throne. That will drop next Thursday. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me via Instagram. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chest podcast, and speak soon.